The Design Abstract official handbook, official strategy guide. Um, Talked about this a little bit in some of the production videos, but I figured I wanted to just lay out exactly what is and is not design abstract composition, because I think a lot of people think I just like throw shit at the wall and then hope for the best, but I'm very, very methodical, and I have a very strict, not only vision, but set of rules that I use and almost never break when I'm writing stuff for the design abstract. So the base layer, what I consider the foundation, it's essentially always going to be there except for orchestral breaks, is the metal section. And the thing is, despite the fact that it's future facing, sci-fi metal, what have you, that remains sounding like metal. I never set out to make it sound robotic or synthesized whatsoever. The drums are as real as they can be given the production of like current metal. Like, we don't have a real drummer, but when we did, I wasn't trying to cut him up to make him perfect. Like, I want it to sound like a performance, even if it's written for a psycho, you know? Same with the guitars. We don't do anything crazy or futuristic or even modern with the guitars. They're very 2000s to 2010s production. Real amps, just fucking tube screamer, angle 5150. We used to have a dual rack, and that's it. We're not like layering synth on those. And same with the bass. It's just a single track or maybe two tracks split off. Just an Ampeg, you know? And the goal for the metal, if you stripped away all the other shit, the synth and the orchestra, I just want it to sound like 2000s Melodeath in terms of writing, kind of, and production. I'm not trying to be modern. I'm not trying to make the drums that are just like these massive, huge, super scooped, like... The sound would work with that direction, but it would not be the correct feel, because I don't want the design abstract feeling super modern. And I know it very easily, it has all the tools that it could, because a lot of like really modern metal, you throw synth in there, you throw orchestra in there, and it's just like, yeah, and that's how it is. And I'm pointedly avoiding that, which is also why I pointedly avoid, even though Logan plays 8 strings, he's literally not allowed to gent. Like, anytime he goes, I'm like, that's being cut. Like, no, because it's a dated sound. I mean, like, it wasn't when we started, but it will be if it isn't already. It is, and like, I'm dating myself with the 2000s metalcore thing too, but I want it to be an artistic choice, not just a product of the time. I want people who like the 2000s Melodeath to hear it and be like, oh, hell yeah. Whereas I don't want people who don't know that they're listening to gent to be like, hell yeah, you know? Because that's just the flavor of metal right now. You listen to Spirit Box and most people aren't thinking, oh, this is gent. But to me, all I'm thinking is, this is fucking gent. And in 10 years from now, that is going to sound like a product of the time in a way that bands that aren't doing that won't, you know? In a way that Ghost won't. They're not going to sound dated in 10 years. You might think back and be like, oh yeah, I listened to them 10 years ago. But if you heard Ghost 10 years ago, you wouldn't pin them down to right now. Like you would with a lot of these like post-gent sort of sounding bands that like their core is that super robotic, syncopated, like that shit, super low tuning. So, bass layer, essentially 2000s Melodeath. There's some other stuff thrown in there, obviously. I'm kind of trying to push more straight death metal. But the point is that it's intentionally not modern, and that's also not just copium because I can't do the production. True, that type of production is not my thing, but it is a choice. I am not trying to just be all out nostalgia bait, but the nostalgia is an aspect of it that I am intentionally using. And so when Logan sends me riffs, I'm vetting all of these riffs based on that, based on if they meet the criteria of the metal section of Design Abstract. And that will almost never change. We'll throw in different riffs here and there, but I'm always aware of what they sound like. And really, if we're doing anything, again, no gent at all. Maybe a couple of rock riffs, definitely some deathcore riffs, but there's a method to it. You can't just write whatever riffs and then just throw them in there. And same with the production. It's intentionally not super modern. It's kind of staying within the bounds of 2000s, 2010s metal. Of course, except for the fact that we sample drums, but I make them sound shitty on purpose. If I just left them the way they were, they would sound better than what I do to them. That's the base foundation layer. The next layer is the orchestra. The orchestra, depending on the song, it isn't happening all of the time, but it definitely happens a lot of the time, and I would argue it's the more recognizable aspect of the band. I know people think it's all synthy, but there isn't really that much synth. It's just our aesthetic looks like that. The logo looks like that, and so you go, oh, there's synth in there. And it's like, yeah, there is, but not nearly as much as orchestra. So another thing with the orchestra is that on and off, I have written it like it's a real orchestra in terms of scoring. Now, the past couple releases, I've got a little lazy and just uses like patches and that type of thing, just like full string patch or whatever. But at the core, it is using a full classical orchestra. All right. Strings, brass, woodwinds, percussion. I don't typically use weird shit in the winds like Septic Flesh or whatever. I've got them, I just don't, because classical orchestra is the goal. And I also do not process that shit in any way. I don't put like modulation effects on them to make them sound synthy or whatever. I'm not putting like choruses. But I'm also just not like processing them. Like literally from the very start, my software has like, you can do mic blend, like close mic, stage mic, and far mic. And at absolute most, what I'm doing is I'm close micing it, and then I'm adding all of those layers to a bus with reverb. It might be EQ'd, maybe, and it might have saturation a little bit. And that's it. That's literally it. Like, I have not put a compressor on an orchestra since Emanate, maybe even before that. That's a very dumb thing to do. The idea for Design Abstract is I would love to actually score it for a real orchestra. And if I did, it would just be XY, like just 2 mics for the room. You can do close mics. They sound amazing. Wouldn't even be necessary. For me, I'm happy with 2 mics. I'm just happy with a stereo recording. So that's what I reduce everything down to. And I don't process the individual tracks because I wouldn't get to if I was actually doing it like that. And that's always my mindset of like, if this were real, if we had the money, then this is how I would do it. So in all the Design Abstract stuff, the orchestra is very untouched. It's very raw. If anything, I'm processing the whole bus, and at that, it's going to be maybe EQ and maybe saturation just to push it through so that it can cut through the mix a little better. And that's it. No weird synthy stuff. You put a phaser on a string patch and it just sounds like a synth instantly. And I'm not doing any of that shit. That's all. Those 2 layers, the metal and then the orchestra, those are what's important to me. Like, I've several times that's been the song, and then I've been like, oh right, our logo looks like that, I should add some synth into this. And I've said this before because it's not a secret, the synth in a lot of these songs is an afterthought. The goal with it really is, how can I sprinkle this in a way where it's present but it doesn't actually change anything. It's like, it's not even icing, it's the color of the icing. Like, it's so, the hardest part with the synth is making it stay the fuck out of the way, that it's not interfering with other stuff. I'm sorry. It's just how it is. I don't really like it. It's just the aesthetic. Not to say I dislike it. It's just not a priority. Rules for the synth depend, because it does sort of shape the color, and like I said, the icing, the color of the icing, those rules have changed. So for example, on Esoteric, almost everything was done with the K2. I had like a Behringer K2 copy of the Korg K20, and almost everything, if not everything, all the arpeggios and everything, probably everything except for pads, were done just on that. That's not been the case. I sold that years ago. But like as an example, and for a while I wanted to primarily use an acid like 303 bass, like whenever I could. That would be like you're opening that and seeing if the 303 works before anything else. I've kind of abandoned that. Now I would say almost everything I use Tone 2's Saurus. Like 80% of what I do is just on that synth for bass and arpeggios. I do the arpeggios myself. I always program arpeggios by hand because I'm a fucking boomer. I will never have a thing where I just hit one note and it goes like ever, because I can just do that. I'll just figure out what it is and do it myself, and I'm just like that. So yeah. And if there's any type of sequenced, like not arpeggiated but like gated, or no, even if there's like a like, I'm still programming that by hand. Almost everything is the Tone 2 Saurus. If I can't make the Saurus do what I want, it's the Tone 2 Gladiator. And for ambient stuff, it's Native Instruments Absinthe if it needs to be like properly ambient. And that's like it. And the rules for that mostly is like, okay, again, this is more modern because these trends have changed a lot. I will almost never do lyrical or melodic stuff on the synth anymore. For a while I had like synth solos. I still do occasionally. I'm more picky about that stuff now. Which case that is a very specific like 70s synth lead that I use, and you know, I try not to make it sound 70s, but if it does, then it does, sure. The sparkly arpeggios, of course, are the big one. With like a phaser sweep, filter sweep. Sorry, you put a phaser on there, but filter sweep is what I'm talking about. Those are pretty critical for the sound of the Design Abstract. But that's sort of the only big one. There's like that pulse, like that thing that I've described happens occasionally. But a lot of the times it gets in the way. For new stuff, there's like one song that does that. But that's kind of it. Like, it's more just like dressing. It's more just like, it's not part of the meal. It's just there to sort of make it look nice and make your brain think a certain thing. Yeah, and I think the workflow right now, like, because the Saurus can do almost everything that the K2 could do, functionally it's doing almost the same thing, where I'm writing in those arpeggios by hand. Quick tip on that: the less notes you use, and I'm not talking about like the rhythm. So if we're talking about straight like 16th or 32nd notes, depending on how fast we're going, like that fast, the amount of notes depends, or like, oh my god, how do I explain it? So the more voices of the chord you put in there, the more it's going to have musical weight, harmonic weight, obviously. So if you want it to just be completely insubstantial and just be like a ghost, just like the suggestion of music, just octaves, right? Just pick one note. If we're in C, because we're always in C, just C across like 4 or 6 octaves, and it's doing a shape that sounds good, right? A little more weight, you add the G. Then, of course, you have more notes to shape the thing out, because with just octaves, you're going to run out of room really quick, and it's going to sound really bad. And then, like, whatever. Fifths are like a good medium, because we're so used to not even listening to the fifth, because like with power chords, right? Like if, there's always going to be one chord that's diminished in the scale, but it's not diminished when you play it on guitar, and we don't even fucking notice it. Like we just don't, because we're so used to just hearing that fifth. So you can get away with scoring like power chords on an arpeggiated synth, and it won't affect your tonality really, but it's extra notes. And then once you start adding the third, then it gets really crunchy. Then not crunchy, but you have to know what you're doing harmonically. Because the things that I said before, just like the one note or the fifth, like you can program like a fifths arpeggio and then throw a full like 4 or 6 chord progression over it, and you don't need to change that note. It can just be CG like that throughout an entire string progression doing like 6 chords, and you don't have to change it. But if you're adding the third, you're gonna have to start changing it. You're gonna have to follow it, and then that's typically, if I'm trying to add some weight, that's what I'll do, and I'll write arpeggios that follow the chord progression, so everything is just arpeggiating those chords that are going on, but it's almost never the same shape. I try to make the peak the same everywhere, but of course it has to jump down to like different gaps in between the notes, and so I'm writing that entire thing by hand. And so if you hear like a string progression that has the classic filter sweep, like I'm writing all that shit up by hand, because I don't know how to do it otherwise. Well, I know how, I just don't like it. I don't like how repetitive it is, so yeah, it's kind of complicated. That's like kind of a staple of the design abstract, I guess. I could do without it, but I understand that that's what people notice because it's like fast, and that's fine. And then I guess included in synth, but really I include it in MISC, is just like I'll also have like sample packs of like whooshes, bass drops, and just noise. And I rarely ever use them in the design abstract. If you want to hear them used, Project Technophage. And yeah, the whooshes and bonks and stuff, that's Dark Future. I don't even know who made it. I just know it's called Dark Future. I don't remember. And any of the noises and like really gritty distorted stuff is Nero from Cyclone 9. I just bought all of his sound libraries. Yeah. These very specific elements combined in this way make up the design abstract. And if they were used differently, it would not be the design abstract. For example, processing orchestra like synth. Maybe I'll do it for like 1 or 2 clips sometimes just as an effect. Same with like the guitars. I'll throw like a filter sweep or a phaser or something on there, but just as an effect, obviously. You can tell the difference. They don't always sound like that. A better example of this would be distortion on classical instruments. You put distortion on a piano, it just sounds like Linkin Park, and there's no way around that. That's okay. But for example, distorted harp, I've used that once. I treat it as synth, though. It gets put in the synth category. It's not orchestra anymore as soon as you distort a single instrument. And yeah, I like the sound occasionally, but I'm going to distort it past the point where it's recognizable to what it originally was. Yeah, another one would be like putting strings through a guitar amp. Sounds fucking awesome. It's not orchestra anymore. It doesn't get to sit with the orchestra kids. And same with like if I used synth in the way that I do in Project Technophage, where it's like every single riff has a counterpoint synth that you're hearing, or an identical synth, or a harmonizing synth. And yes, for some riffs we do that, but it's buried, right? It's down a layer. It's underneath the orchestra. It's underneath the vocals. Where in Project Technophage, just the whole fucking thing, right? You like hear a synth and there's like over top of whatever's happening, like constantly, and it's a fun sound. And there's a reason that sound isn't the design abstract anymore. It's very cheesy, it's very fun, and I think it would take away from the severity of the plot a lot. This isn't like somber, melancholy music, but it's definitely not fun or silly. And that's one of the reasons for it, is because the synth almost never has the dominant voice, and that's on purpose. That's, you could say, by design. it's just the feel. It's all this shit's in my head. I'm trying to get it out. If we're making a rule book, that's one of the rules. You get one synth solo if you've already exhausted your guitar solo, and that's the only time the synth takes precedence over the orchestra and the metal, unless it's just doing mindless arpeggios. Right, this is a rule book. Okay, because this is literally how I think, so this is what we're going to do. That is literally a rule. If you're going to have a synth solo, you have to have already had a guitar solo, and that's the only time the synth gets to take priority, okay? Otherwise, you maybe get one prominent synth hook per release, which I don't believe I took on the new one, actually. But I feel like somewhere I did that in Transhuman. I'm sure there was like a synth hook that isn't a solo, maybe. But that's how sparing it is. And that is the rules, because like I said, I can just say these are the rules. You also get one orchestra break per song up to half of the amount of total songs on the album. So for example, 6-track album, 3 of those can have a spot where the metal cuts out and it's just sweeping orchestra and no more. Those are the rules. At least one of those cannot have synth with the orchestra. I really try to limit that. It sounds fucking cool, but it can't every time, or people associate those two. And like I'm thinking is like, how are people gonna take this? And I don't want people to think that the orchestra, oh my god, my fucking arms. I don't want people to think that the orchestra is always gonna have a shun dun 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 or whatever underneath it, because it doesn't, because they're different. Other rules. We've got some groove to the writing, especially when Logan's the one writing. But we are not a super breakdown-y band. Like, the riffs aren't easy. And so to make sure of that, whenever there's a breakdown in a song, it's the hardest part of the song, or close to it. I can't make it always literally the hardest part, because that, like, it's an arbitrary decision, and enforcing that would be batshit insane, actually, like, in practice. But you'll notice whenever there's breakdowns, they're always weirdly complicated, and especially if I'm writing them, you like can't headbang to them until after you've memorized them. That's on purpose. That's just because I don't want it to be reduced to something easy. I want it to be complicated in that specific way, complicated in a writing way. Yeah, that's just another rule. Like, these are literal rules that are in my head when I'm doing this. And I guess lastly, we haven't touched on vocals. Vocals, I'm actively trying to break the mold, because the rules for vocals used to be very simple. Always lows, and one section is cleans. That's it. The cleans themselves, it would about like 10 to 15 layers. 3 unison, 2 to 3 third harmony, a pedal, or if there's a chord progression, following the chord progression. So basically you just sing the root note of the chord progression. Sometimes you just sing a melody within the chord progression, but typically the melody is already going to be in the chord progression. So you're just singing the root, or if it's over a riff, you're just singing the pedal tone, whatever tuning you're in. Then a falsetto on top of that, and that's the most varied, because that might be an octave. Well, chances are it's going to be an octave, but sometimes it'll be a counter melody, approximately an octave above the unison. And very occasionally I'll take it down and do an octave below, but not usually anymore. That was always the rules for the clean vocals. I don't do that as much in the new stuff. It's basically just your main your main melody, probably still triple layered, and then like one harmony and maybe a pedal, and that's it. Or like 2 tracks but only 1 harmony, like third harmony hard panned is what I'm trying to say, and then maybe a pedal, and that's it. And they're mixed way down, because I'm trying to strip it down a bit. But for the harsh vocals, ever since Corrupt, I was like only lows. Just because that's what I want the sound to be. Obviously, I have a crazy fucking range. I can make it all sorts of stuff, and I am slowly kind of pushing towards that. the new rules are looking like it's going to be just whatever fits the section, because I'm always worried of the music sounding too disjointed, and like you go to the next part and you're like, what the hell is that, and not in a good way. And so I've really limited down my range, because I don't want to switch sections and all of a sudden it's like, who the hell is this guy? It's like, oh sorry, it's me, I'm just that diverse. Like, I have to get over myself. Like, chances are people aren't going to be scared off when I switch different styles, and I'm gonna have to, because I'm finding the screams super fucking monotonous. I'm just not digging it right now. So that will be new rules. But as far as how that's implemented, like even with the clean vocals, I have a specific tone, and I've changed it. The tone for the past few, from Technotheism, the Technotheism trilogy, that vocal tone has always been as high as possible, but as clean as possible. I'm basically just trying to be Christian from like that era of Scar Symmetry, and that's not a secret. That should be very obvious. That's what I'm trying to do. But doing enough session gigs, like I did like a shit ton of gigs on Fiverr, it was helpful in seeing, because people wanted specific tones from my voice, whether I thought it would sound good or not. And because of that, I have changed the way I'm doing newer design abstract. It's not as clean anymore. And since I'm singing with a harsher tone, I can afford a lot less layers, which is really nice. It's more efficient, and I think it works. It still sounds like me, but it's got some grit to it, and I'm not trying to be like as high as possible. And I've been trying to break the mold for that too, like in Transhuman, because it used to be all the clean vocals were only belting, and only a couple songs have vocals that aren't belting, like just absolute all out. Now Medem had these really soft, like the super breathy, this shit vocals, and like I completely cut that out of Transhuman, not because I didn't like it, I guess I got sick of it, or I never thought of it. You know, the songs were never chill enough to do that. There was like not a spot you could do that. Nothing wrong with those, but it would be nice to introduce literally any mid-range vocals on, like, clean vocals, like I do in Voiicide, right? I just don't do that in Design Abstract, and that was a rule, because I wanted my voice to just, every time you hear it, it's like as powerful as possible in the cleans. And so I wrote everything really high and super layered, and I'm just kind of over that now, but that was the rules. That being said, there's almost no soft, clean vocals in the new one. But after that, and speaking of the future, strictly speaking, not a lot of this will change. The 2000s Melodeath thing will be a little more lenient. We're going to add some more influencers. We're going to add more rock. We're probably going to add more metalcore. And the way I approach vocals is just going to change. It's going to be more like Voiicide, as I've talked about. Yeah. Other little details for things, even as far as the orchestra itself, we don't really sound like, say, Flesh God Apocalypse, like kind of, only sometimes, because the goal for the Zen Abstract has always been symphonic death metal that is future-facing instead of sounding antiquated, because Flesh God Apocalypse is really good at making things sound old, and they've got all their instruments done up with the little things, the little sound holes for your string instruments, and it's fine, it's a vibe, but if nothing else, I want to avoid that vibe. And so the orchestra does not sound old-timey at all. I try to not even make it sound string quartet-y. It sounds film score-ish. Again, should be obvious, but that is in the way that the various parts do or don't have movement, and in our case don't. Holding sustained whole notes, you know, in the industry they call them goose eggs, because it's a whole note. It was cute. Fucking a lot of those in the scoring for the Design Abstract, because film score. So a lot of the times it's just going to be a pad strings written more or less like a synth, because it's just blocking off this whole section just for enforcing the harmony, just the underlying chords. And as you've seen in like production videos, the top voice or the second top voice will be doing like a bit of a melody, but that melody is largely a byproduct of just having those voices moving, and it stays out of the way. That melody in the high or mid voice and the strings it'll be there, but it will not be the main melody most of the time ever, because there will be vocals there will be guitar there, or there'll even be another instrument there on top of it, but those melodies are always going to be there. Film score is designed to make you feel emotions, but cognitively not distract you, right? It's designed to be there but stay out of the way, like video game music as well, right? So the themes and the melodies they're not nothing, but they're not as prominent, and it's not like a really rhythmic, like if you have this sweeping film score, the melody wouldn't be like like that. That's a theme. That's like, the theme melody for the opening. But if there's like a dramatic, vast scene, you're gonna have this like something drawn out, right? Like you're not gonna have all these quick like it wouldn't make sense, right? And with string quartet writing, which is a lot of where Flesh God went, there's a lot more movement because you've only got 4 parts, and so just playing drawn out sustain notes, like it has a vibe, but it's is different. That's a lot of what we're doing basically. The orchestral stuff is largely like film score-ish is how I describe it. It's always very big, it's always very dramatic. It's never going to you're never going to get fun wink wink out of it. It's always very stoic and very grand, and if you just solo it, you're not going to hear fun little Easter eggs in the lyrics or in the solo tracks or whatever. Like it's very like that. It's sort of like if the instrument is orchestra, then the style is film score, much like if the instrument is metal, then the style is 2000s, 2010s Melodeath, as well as the production, because to me those things kind of go hand in hand. The type of thing that you are playing has to line up with the production. Like nobody is playing gent with Metallica production because it wouldn't be music. Those two things have to go hand in hand. Maybe we'll do a follow bonus video, or we haven't talked about that. Yeah, let's see what else. I think that covers all the bases. Metal is the foundation. Orchestra is basically the bulk of it. The vocals are the vocals, and then the synth is on top for flavor, for color, for vibe. Basically, almost nothing substantial harmonically or melodically happens with the synth. It's just dressing. And then in production, you just have whooshes and bangs and noises and stuff like that, and that's pretty rare in the design abstract. I've always thought of those as crutches. Like if you have to into a transition, it's because musically you haven't set up that transition well enough. So, I try to lean away from that, but there's times like that. I guess the only other thing that I do use in both the design abstract and Project Technophage, basically in anything, is you find the grittiest, most awful grating noise possible, and then you just put like an 8th note tremolo with 100%. So beep 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 beep. You just do that over top of like a breakdown or whatever, or 16th, and it's just this grinding, grating, hopefully morphing noise sound over like 8 bars, and the whole time you just got this and like that sounds fucking amazing. And I use that for both. It's still, I would argue it's not the most prominent thing, but that's just like a thing. It's like, is it synth? Not really. It's like noise, but with a specific 100% tremolo on 8th or 16th notes. A little tidbit. I think that's a fairly comprehensive like user manual for the design abstract. User manual? What did I call it before? I don't know. I'm sure I've overlooked something, but the point is that it's not just random, and it hasn't really just been random since Emanate. Emanate had lots of weird shit in it. Like, I know some people like that album, but I mean, I could just do a track by track of why it sucks. Like, I don't know, man. The genres are kind of all over the place. Like, people are like, oh yeah, it's metalcore. Well, it's not really metalcore because it has like no metalcore riffs, or maybe like 2 metalcore riffs. But then it's got like weird pop punk stuff, and then genre guitar playing that I literally couldn't even name because it's just like nothing. It's just like ring outs and breakdowns. I guess that's metalcore. It's like the shittiest. If it's metalcore, it's literally the shittiest metalcore band ever. I also didn't have those rules in place for stuff, and a lot of them did kind of coincidentally follow the rules, but like a lot of it didn't, and it was kind of a mess. And the thing is, when you're using as many influences, or not even influences, just sounds, things, as we are, you have to have that. Like, in my opinion, it is not good to have the beginner's mindset or the learner's mindset. It's like, hey, you can do anything you want. It's like, not if you're trying to make an album. Like, if you're trying to just make a musical statement that just is itself, then sure, literally do whatever you want. Throw the fucking phaser on the strings, put like a gated synth that goes, but then make that fully orchestral or like classically voiced. It's just gonna sound like synth. It's just gonna sound. They scored that synth. They have like 4 voice part leading harmony in synth stuff. Anyway, yeah, do experimental shit with the metal. Put all this crazy processing on it. 1-to-1 layer it with synth so it sounds like fucking Clayton shit. Like, fine. And then in another song, it's just completely classical over doom riffs. I don't know. Yeah, see, fucking Emanate did that. Like, the outro was like, oh, fucking whatever. Getting sidetracked. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I have never wanted to be experimental, and I don't like the I'm going to put on an album and who knows what I'm going to get. Like, no, I want every single fucking song to sound like it belongs on the same album. And so you have to lay down these rules because you have so many options otherwise. There's so many things you could do that you have to rein it in. You have to have focus to it. And you can let the leash up a little bit, kind of here and there, do some interesting things. On Metum Technosis, there was a couple like solo cello things, which is arguably more string quartet. Well, it's not, it's a string solo, but you know. Or like having kind of more doomy atmospheric stuff, whatever that one song was called. It was in B flat. I literally know the tuning, I don't even know the song name. That was more just like flowy and chordy and more atmospheric. I don't think that was a good decision. I guess maybe it could have worked if it was implemented better. So yeah, you know what? No, I'm not even condoning this. I don't think you should do that. Like, if you're going to use all these influences, synth, orchestra, metal, and noises, I guess, it needs to be focused. You not only need to know the genre that you're aiming for, you need to know the genre of every section that could theoretically be a standalone, and have that direction in mind, right? So like I said, with metal, for us, with metal, it's 2000s, 2010s Melodeath, Dark Tranquility, At the Gates, Scar Symmetry, obviously, Soilwork, kind of. And it's fun because like Logan doesn't listen to any of that shit, so I just have to tell him, and then I just cut riffs that don't fit. Orchestra, film score, basically big Hollywood film score. We're not trying to sound overly classical. Like, it's not trying to sound smart on purpose. We could do that, but it's not that. And same, it's not like antiquated sounding like string quartet or like chamber, something like that. It isn't, and it could be, but it isn't. And with synth, that one is decidedly not even really its own genre. Like, it's basically, like I said, it's arpeggios and it's flavor. Like, you're never gonna get like the techno in Design Abstract. Like, maybe there was probably a time I've probably done that, but no electronic percussion at all. That's a rule. That's one of the arbitrary rules. And I used to have these like trap hats, and occasionally maybe I'll use it for one section. I'll have this which sounds like kind of industrial, but it is kind of like trap hats. And that's just almost never the vibe. Like the electronic stuff is just, it's stripped down. It wouldn't even stand on its own. Like the metal would, ideally. And the orchestra, it would sound empty. It would sound like film score missing like its main theme, but it would still work. The synth, no, it's just flavor. It's just like production, essentially. Same will like use a bass synth just to layer the chorus, but like that stuff really wouldn't necessarily sit on its own. And with the electronic elements, yeah, there is almost never like percussion. Because it's the wrong sound, because I don't want the overall sound of the band to feel electronic. And if I'm using techno kicks or I'm using trap hats, it's gonna push that direction more in a way that, even if this makes sense to no one else, it's the rules for me because it makes sense to me. Because even if you're using synth, that's a lot different than using all this like clicky, prickly sort of like percussion stuff, like electronic hats and stuff. In closing, I'll like use a different example. If you haven't, I'm assuming if you've watched this shit, you've listened to like Ethereal Void and Design Abstract. So Gods of a Dead World, like we're going to keep doing scoring like that. And it is markedly different than the Design Abstract, because not only am I trying much more to make it stay out of the way, like I'm using scoring in Ethereal Void the way I use synth in Design Abstract. It's more just like a hint, it's decoration. The music could completely stand on its own without it, and it's more just like a suggestion of certain things. I also get to practice like more horror scoring. So if Design Abstract is like Hollywood action movie film score, Ethereal Void is like horror action movie. Like there's a lot of really crunchy, disgusting stuff that I use, and it's all very sparse. There's lots of layers, but it's really kind of just meeting the bare minimum of being there. But I do get to use a lot of ugly tonality because that band uses a lot of ugly tonality. And so there's a few just like, there's this big like wah, where like the strings do sort of like this, like if you took one on a piano and went like that. But it's just a fucked cluster chord, right? And just this and like, oh, it's so cool, and you don't get to use that in Design Abstract, and that's really fun. But that is an example of like, okay, for Ethereal Void, the goal isn't obviously mellow death, 2000s 2010s mellow death or whatever. It's just straight death metal, and with that production I don't really have anything in mind other than death metal. It's going to be loud. I want it to be big. I don't want it to be like modern, but it should be as huge as we can get it. That's like, you know, they're the same instrument because in both bands it's my sample libraries and Logan's guitar, but they're used for different things. And then same with the orchestra. Although the orchestra, I'm using the same samples as I am in the Design Abstract, it's a different style. And these are the rules, and this is my point. For Design Abstract, these are the rules. You could theoretically follow these to create similar music, or you could start your own rules in order to make something different and better. The only thing I will say though is if you're not playing 2000s 2010s mellow death, if you're playing something more modern, your orchestra writing and your strings, it's all just going to sound modern. It's all just going to be lumped in with modern metal, and we are too sometimes, but like it really isn't, because I don't try to make it sound modern on purpose. Because once you get into modern metal and it's just like you're using the assumption that computers are being used, even though computers are always being used, for whatever reason, that just entails whatever possible shit you can throw at a song, you're just going to use it. But my problem with that is that the orchestral components of modern metal sounds aren't scored or scoreable. And if you just listened solo to the orchestra parts, it would just be boring and shitty and nothing. I recorded a whole section here, and then the audio got fucked up because this cable that I'm using is the one that my son uses as a toy, and I can't believe it's worked this far. So, modern metal being the genre, not just the observation. There is a genre that's called modern metal. I'm going to check to make sure the audio is still working. Okay. My take on what I'm calling modern metal is this. Imagine you've got the raw metal section of a song, just the metal, and you import it into Logic, and then you open up that left-hand library panel that has like sampled piano, synth piano, synthesized strings that sound real, synthesized strings that don't sound real, all sorts of synths. You got your 808 synth or samples, 909s, everything. Like, they give you the tools that whatever music you're making, they have something to offer. And the mindset is that you're taking this library and just applying it to this metal song however you see fit, right? No rules, whatever you think sounds best. And obviously that takes talent, and there's nothing wrong with that. But as I said, that's not scored or scorable. Like, if you took that and then you tried to make an orchestral section out of it, it would take more work than writing the fucking song did in the first place. It's not designed. The orchestral parts there are more incidental. They're not designed to be orchestral parts, and that's the difference, in my opinion, between like modern metal and the design abstract. Is those sections are critical to the composition. They are not just production layers like they tend to be in modern metal arrangements. I pride myself on specific arrangements for the design abstract, if not all of it, that if you just listen to the orchestra, it still sits on its own at bare minimum, as well as the instrumental or orchestral for Progenies of the Great Apocalypse or Gateways. That's my goal. That's a rule. And I don't always meet it. In the Decryptor, I sure fucking did. That score is amazing. I keep meaning to, I want to release that just as a score. But typically that's the goal. Now the thing is, does that contradict with making the actual songs sound as good as possible? Why, yes, it does. There's many times where if the guitars and shit are good enough, you don't actually need orchestra. Plaguebringers was like that. That song is just kind of a death metal song. Or Agents of Retribution. I really struggled to fit orchestra into there. And then it's like, wait, well, doesn't it just not need to be there then? Yeah, you would think, but guess what? That's a rule. You gotta solo the orchestra and listen through, and if it's boring and it just sounds like nothing, something has to be there. And I know it's stupid, because then it's not what's best for the song. Them's the rules.